we got today. We've got the Kennedy years, the Johnson years, and Vietnam as our three topics. And some of this, obviously, what we did with civil rights is we went all the way through civil rights. So it just kind of overlaps a bunch of different presidencies, and we'll might mention things again about that as we go. And when we finish up Vietnam, we'll be into the Nixon years. So what we talk about then, the Monday after uh, 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 Labor Day, will include some of what we talk about tonight. The election of 1960, it was kind of interesting. It was Kennedy and Johnson had both run for the Democratic nomination. They were, if you like, rivals with each other. They never liked each other. But when Kennedy gets the nomination, he's smart enough to know that if he doesn't carry Texas, he's not going to be president of the United States. And so he made Bobby Kennedy, who absolutely detested Johnson, go over and offer Johnson the number 2 place on the ticket. Johnson didn't want it, but he didn't want to be completely out of the power structure, so he accepted. And the problem with Kennedy, of course, was his youth. I remember both my parents saying that they had voted for Nixon. They did it because they didn't think that Kennedy had enough experience. Now, my dad came from a small town in southern Ohio, so he grew up Republican. My mother tended. My mother, somewhere in one of my scrapbooks that my maternal grandfather kept, he's got a letter from FDR thanking him for something he'd sent him. So I assume my mother grew up Democratic. But again, because of the youth of the Kennedys, she was concerned. Well, so was Eisenhower. Eisenhower tried to during the transition period, the interim period, he tried to get John Kennedy to come in and listen to him talk about the issues that he might have to face. But I think Kennedy had done his whole campaign on the basis of I don't know what word to use, the stodginess of the 8 Republican years. And if you listen to his inaugural address, which is one of the great inaugural addresses of all time, when he says the torch has been passed to a new generation, and that's the way he approached things. Well, it's okay to approach things that it's a new generation, but you also got to understand how we got to where we got. Kennedy had argued all through the campaign that there was a missile gap, that we were falling behind the Russians in terms of missiles. Well, actually, it was just the opposite. We had a huge advantage in missiles. But what Eisenhower, and nobody could understand how he could do this, an old army man, he basically paid no attention to our conventional ground forces. We were way behind in terms of tanks, in terms of up to date weaponry, and it made our allies a little nervous. We're sitting behind a 3,500-mile moat. It's going to be hard to get at us, but it's pretty easy to get at West Germany, to get at France, and even England. And we can talk about the massive retaliation. That's fine for us, but that doesn't work for them. So it's a little bit of an issue. But Kennedy wins. He wins because Johnson carries Texas for him, and Mayor Daley finds enough bodies in the graveyard to carry Illinois for him, and he wins by the barest of bare margins. And the problem, of course, is that kind of haunts him. the whole time he's there. Is that
Sorry. Me too. Oh, Jeff, did you order that pizza?
well, at St. George's, we were supposed to tell the kids to put the phones in. They had a shoe thing where you put shoes in, and they had one in each classroom. I never remembered to tell them to do it, and the truth is, didn't care. My classes were small enough. I never saw anybody back there on their phone. I had a few on their computer that I wondered what they were doing. There were some sports betting sites that I think got worn out during AP European history this year, which was all right. But I was headed for retirement, so I didn't. I wasn't quite as strict. You know that the phones and the other thing was dress code. I don't have any clue what the dress code says, number one. And number two, I don't notice whether you're wearing the dress code or not. And the reality is, dress codes, sorry, ladies, are written for girls and not boys. You tell a boy he can wear shorts, and he's going to show up in some kind of soccer style shorts that come all the way down to his knees. On Friday night at a football game, you tell the girl she can wear shorts, and it barely covers her rear end. And you sit here and say, did their mama let them out of the house looking like that? Well, in most cases, the answer is no. They went out of the house with something their mamas approved, but they stopped somewhere on the way and wore something that they hoped their mamas wouldn't see. Well, all right, I'm sorry. I'm off. But the two things that perhaps we most associate in terms of the torch being passed to a new generation that we associate with Kennedy. One is the Peace Corps. That we're going to get young people who are finishing college, and they're going to give 2 years of their lives to go work in a foreign area. I had one of my favorite St. George's alumni who's graduating from Rhodes College, or I guess he just graduated from Rhodes College, stopped by to see me this year and said that he was going to join the Peace Corps. He was going to go to Panama for 2 years. And he said when he went in and talked to the committee, he said, I had 3 years of Spanish, but my Spanish is not real good. And the committee said, you won't need it. How are you with indigenous languages? And he said, oops, they're going to be speaking a language I've never heard. And but he'll handle it really, really well. But the other thing that we associate with Kennedy is NASA. Kennedy's the one who said that it should be the goal of the United States to put a man on the moon and successfully return him to Earth within the next decade. And we do. Now, Kennedy's gone by then, but in the Nixon years in '69, we do have our first moon landing. So those are two things where Kennedy inspires perhaps a new approach to things. Unfortunately, if he paid a little more attention to what Eisenhower told him, he might not have had some of the rough spots he had. And the roughest of all of the spots, of course, is the Bay of Pigs. Now, this had all been planned by the CIA. It had all been planned completely with Eisenhower's blessing. And the goal was to take all of these Cuban exiles, the people that had run away from Cuba when Castro took over, train them in the jungles of Central America, and then without putting them in any kind of uniforms or without anything that would look like the United States of America, have dropped them down in Cuba under the belief that Castro was the Cuban people hated Castro, and they would respond to this, and they would come, and if need be, there would be American destroyers off the coast that could assist, and we could use some planes if we needed to. And Eisenhower, all this was worked out under Eisenhower before he went out of office. So when Kennedy comes in, almost immediately that's what's presented to him. Remember, Kennedy is inaugurated in January of '61. In April of '61, the CIA people come and present this plan to him. Now Kennedy's skeptical, but again he's a neophyte. He hadn't done this before. They don't share stuff like this with Congress, with freshman senators in his case. He had no clue. He also had, as everybody did, had absolute trust in the CIA that if they said this is foolproof, this is going to happen. But he was insistent there should be absolutely nothing that could tie this to the United States. Obviously, people are likely to figure that out. But if these people go in, we're not going in after them. And that was clear to the CIA. Well, as it turns out, the invasion was it was a fiasco. Unfortunately, there are 1,400 people that get dropped down on the beaches in what was called the Bay of Pigs. The people in Cuba don't rise up. The Cuban army is much better than the CIA had anticipated, and so they immediately close off any exits off the beach before it's all over with. And of course, the military people are beating on Kennedy. We got to go in there. We got to send the Marines in. We got to protect these people. And Kennedy rightfully refused to do so. And what happens, of course, is that I think something like 1,200 of them are captured and put to work in the sugarcane plantations. A couple of hundred are killed. And suddenly, America's embarrassed. Everybody knew we did this. There was no hiding it. And it angered Kennedy. Number one, he was angry with himself for allowing this to happen. But he was also angry with the CIA. And he reined the CIA in big time. Put that in the back of your mind when we get to the assassination, because that's one of the rumors about the assassination, was that the CIA wanted to get their revenge on him. Again, here I gave you the Drake theory of the Cold War a couple of weeks ago, and to a degree, the Cold War is a matter of public relations. Who looks good? Who won that one and who lost that one? We lost that one big time. And Khrushchev, who is in charge in Russia, milks that for all it's worth. Now, unfortunately, the Kennedys they're focused on getting rid of Castro. The CIA has all these plots to assassinate him. We got to get rid of this guy. The fact that he exists and he is an ally of the Russians, and he's 90 miles from Key West, just really bothered the Kennedys. But right now, Khrushchev, I think, believed that he could get away with almost anything because Kennedy was young. He was wet behind the ears. He didn't understand international politics. He would be able to push him around. Well, all of that changes then in October of 1962, when the U-2 planes show pictures that there are missile bases for offensive missiles being placed in Cuba. This is the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis. And I will tell you, the Cuban Missile Crisis scared the fire out of me. I had a math teacher who was a navigator in World War II, and he stayed in the Air National Guard, and he was convinced that he was going to get called up into active service to go in and deal with these missiles. He wasn't. He was called in for Vietnam. He ended up flying missions into Cambodia late in the Vietnam War, but he managed to escape the missile crisis. Now, the theory is, I think, is that what Khrushchev wanted to do was to get these missiles into Cuba secretly, without America knowing it, and then be able to announce the world that they're there, and America would have, there'd be nothing to do about it. And the argument, of course, is we got missiles in Turkey, which we did. Turkey was in NATO, and they wanted the missiles there. The fact that they were not very good missiles is immaterial. The argument could easily be, if you got your missiles 90 miles away from us, why shouldn't we be allowed to have missiles 90 miles away from you? The problem, of course, is that when it becomes known, then now it's Khrushchev that's caught in the bind. He's arguing that these are for defense only. Well, no, they weren't. I mean, again, they had intermediate range ballistic and I've forgotten what the others were, but some of them could get as far as the Mississippi River. Others could get virtually almost all the way to the Pacific, and so they could strike at any part of America they wanted to. Now, we knew that the Russians had put MiGs and had trained the Cubans, and you can't argue with that. They had also put ground-to-air missiles to shoot down the planes. Those are clearly defensive. So what happens then is the question is that and if you happen to be I don't read much historical fiction. In fact, I read very little, but I do like Jeff Shara, and his most recent book is on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's a novel because he makes up situations and he makes up dialogue, but the dialogue's always all consistent with what people said. He's not making up things that they didn't, and it's pretty well done. But the question is, how is America going to respond? Because again, Khrushchev is banking on the fact that he can get these in before the November elections. That Kennedy will be so distracted trying to keep his margins in the House and Senate that he can get these into Cuba, and then by the time that happens, it'll be too late for America to do anything about it, but to say, well, they're here. So once we find out they're there, and I remember seeing when Kennedy finally releases the YouTube pictures, they're pretty scary. What those people had, because they come really close to getting all of this done as Khrushchev wanted it done, but not quite. And so then the question is, how do we respond? Well, the military response, what all of his military advisors want is either go in there and bomb the fire out of them, although we know if we bomb, we're not going to get everyone. I mean, we'll get most of them, but we won't get all. And what we don't get can then drop an ICBM down on Washington, D.C. The second thing is send in the Marines. Let's go after them. That way we can be sure we get it all. And basically create a scenario for World War III. Again, if we respond militarily, all they got to do is hit one button, and suddenly we've gone from a ground war and our desire to get rid of Castro to nuclear war, and nobody may survive. So what the Kennedys decide, and it's not terribly popular. with an awful lot of his advisors, he decides to do what he called a quarantine. That they drew a circle around Cuba and said that the American Navy was going to stop any ship headed for Cuba that had any. We're going to go through it. We'd let foodstuffs and we'd let petroleum products go on through. But if you got any kind of war-making device at all, then we're gonna stop it. We're not gonna allow any more, and until you get those missiles out. Now that then puts the hurts back on Khrushchev. He's got to go to his people, and Khrushchev's, he's not exactly. If Kennedy's the smooth, debonair politician, Khrushchev's anything but. All of us our age remember him in the UN beating on the table with his shoe, which certainly it was not exactly what you expect a diplomat to do. But he's got, as Kennedy's got opposition within his government, Khrushchev's got opposition within his too. And he did all of this without letting them know that he was doing it. The Politburo finds out this is happening when the Americans announce to the world that it's happening. And so the question now is, how can we get out of this without embarrassing somebody? What you don't want to do is say either you do it our way or else, because what that leads is to somebody pushing the button. You got to give Khrushchev a way that he can back out, and so eventually the deal is the Russians will remove the weapons under UN oversight, and that although it's not part of the announced decision, the Americans agree that within 6 months they will pull the missiles out of Turkey. The truth is, 3 or 4 Polaris submarines that can fire nuclear weapons off the coast of Turkey are a lot more effective than those missiles we had there. So we weren't really losing anything. And in that way, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tension is going away. This is when the duck and cover drill. We all did duck and cover drill. Get under your desk and put your hands over your head if there's an atomic blast. Oh, great! I was at Westminster, and they built this beautiful new administration building, and they built one instead of the boys' school, girls' school, and then the middle and lower school having their own cafeterias. They built one cafeteria for everybody. Well, for the little ones getting from their building over, they built a tunnel that so that they could get from their building to the Presley building without having to go outside. And it was a designated air raid shelter. It had all of the bells and whistles. You go down one side and there were these big metal containers filled with water. Well, one of the fun things to do was go down and beat on those as you went down the hallway and listen to it reverberate. On the other side there was wood. Boxes of food. So that if somebody dropped an atomic bomb on Atlanta, Georgia, we could all go down there. And I remember my mother, who was maybe the best teacher I've ever been around, but she taught 4th grade. And she said, "Do you really think I'm going to take 4th graders into that tunnel?" Said, "I'll go out and take my chances with the bomb before I'll do that." Now the tunnel's still there. I'm assuming but people were on our way in from our house to Westminster. There was, you could see they dug down a hole and put in a fallout shelter. I can't imagine, but that was that was where we were. Eventually, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the things that does happen as a result of the frustration between Russia and the United States, the Berlin Wall was built in August of 1961. That's not so much Russia as it is East Germany, because when Berlin is an open city, the East Germans can make their way into East Berlin, take the trolley across the border into West Berlin, and then get on a train and go to West Germany. And it's an embarrassment that these East Germans would rather live in West Germany than in East Germany. So the wall is built, and then the boundary between East Germany and West Germany is made more secure. The one plus, I guess, in '63 is that the Americans and the Russians work out the first deal relative to nuclear weapons. It's limited. What it says is no atmospheric testing. You can still build all the nuclear bombs you want to, but you have to test them underground. And so that's a small victory, but at least it is a victory in the right direction. In November of 1963, and again, I'm convinced, I tell my kids that for every generation, there seems to be something that happens that changes the direction of history. For my parents' generation, it was Pearl Harbor or the collapse of the stock market. I don't know which, depending on how you saw it. From my generation and most of your generations, it was the Kennedy assassination. Most people can tell you exactly where they were when they heard that Kennedy had been assassinated. And then for our children's generation, obviously it's 9/11. And I keep telling all my students when I had them, I said, it will happen for you. To me, history just makes sense. I know it doesn't to a lot of people, but history just kind of moves along like a river. But all of a sudden, every now and then, that river runs into something and changes direction. And I think all of those are things of that nature. The Kennedy's in Texas. He's in Texas because he is trying to rebuild fences. This is November of '63. In 11 months, he's going to run for re-election. He's not convinced that Johnson will be invited to be his vice president again. And so the question is, can he build fences that don't depend on Lyndon Johnson? And of course, he's assassinated by James Earl Ray. Interesting.
Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey. Oh God, James Earl Ray. That's the guy that killed MLK. Sorry, too many people getting killed. Lee Harvey Oswald. And it's it obviously it's the first president to be assassinated since 1900 or 1901, since McKinley was killed. It kept up a tradition that every president born in a year evenly divisible by 10 from 1840 through 1960 was either died in office or was assassinated in office. Reagan finally broke the string when he didn't get killed, but everyone, if the year was evenly divisible by 10, they either died in office or they were assassinated, which is kind of scary. Johnson now becomes president, and I kind of am of two minds on Lyndon Johnson. I think Lyndon Johnson could have been a superior president, but I also think he made all the wrong decisions relative to Vietnam. One of the people that Neil and I went to the Atlanta History Center to hear Doris Kearns Goodwin. And if you hadn't read her most recent book, you ought to get it, folks. It's fabulous. I asked the guy that heads the History Center, I said, how many people were there? he said, we put up 701 chairs, and I think all of them were taken. But she was just fabulous. Doris Kearns had been an aide to Johnson in the White House. And her husband, Dick Goodwin, who's 11 or 12 years older than she is, had been a major speechwriter for JFK, and didn't like Johnson, but got sucked in. In fact, it was Dick Goodwin that coined the term Great Society for Johnson's domestic programs. Johnson is able to get some things done because of the Kennedy assassination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been introduced by the Kennedys as the Civil Rights Act of 1963, and Johnson is able to go in. And, Johnson knew where all the bodies were buried. He was an intimidating human being. He was big. He loved to get in your face and get you to do what he wanted to do. He's able to get the Civil Rights Act of 64 passed by getting enough Republican moderates to vote with the Democratic liberals to shut up the Boll Weevils of the South and stop the filibuster in the Senate. And once he got the filibuster stopped, then passing that was not an issue. In 64, he runs for re-election. And in 64, we probably get, this year may be an exception. I hadn't figured this year's election out. I'll let y'all argue that on your own at some time. I love government. I hate politics. But we probably have the clearest division between liberal and conservative in 64 that we've ever had. You got the liberal Lyndon Johnson. You've got the extreme conservative Barry Goldwater, and it becomes one of the most by the first election I paid any attention to was 60. By 64, I missed voting in 64 by 1 month. I turned 18 in December, and the election was in November. So I was actually I kept up with this stuff, and you get all kinds of wonderful things. Barry Goldwater, in your heart, he's right, and then people talking about Goldwater saying that he might use atomic weapons in Vietnam, and so the Democrats come back and say, in your heart, he might. Or in your heart, he's far right. All kinds of wonderful things. But it really is not very close. The country is liberal then. It's our liberal phase. All the people that whine about the Supreme Court now being so conservative. Well, everybody whined about the Supreme Court then being so liberal. I remember driving to the group of kids from summer camp to the Nantahala River to canoe the Nantahala. And everywhere you went in these backwoods in North Carolina, there were impeach Earl Warren signs. Get rid of that guy. So the times, they are a changing, as Peter, Paul, and Mary once said. But the election's not close. I think Goldwater. I think Johnson wins by something like 17 million votes, and Goldwater carries Arizona and 5 bedrock southern states: South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. I think in Louisiana are the 5 he carried. Johnson carries everything else, and so Johnson and Humphrey become the president, vice president of the United States. If Johnson had focused only on what he called the war on poverty, I think he would have been a terrific president. That's my assessment. There are, in the 20th century in the United States, there are 3 times that you get a huge outpouring of domestic legislation. One, obviously, is the New Deal. We're in the middle of crisis. Congress, if FDR said, I want this, Congress vomited it out and it went. The second are the first 2 years of Woodrow Wilson's term. When you get all of these major pieces of progressive legislation, he gets 4 huge bills. He gets the Clayton Act, Federal Trade Commission Act, the Federal Reserve Act, and the Underwood-Simmons, gets all of that in 2 years' time. Now, the outbreak of the war in Europe kind of short circuits the last 6 years he's there, but those 4. But I think the Great Society falls just behind that. Johnson's he's dirt poor. He comes from almost nowhere in Texas. He works his way up. He was a school teacher at one time. He owned radio and television stations, and he found his niche in politics. And he never lost the heart he had for people who were not as well off as he was or as he became. And so, with the Great Society and the War on Poverty, you get 4 major focuses that I think were remarkable. One was massive amounts of aid to education. For the first time now, particularly some of you all remember Operation Head Start, where we want to make sure that those children who don't live in houses where we read to our children every night and they're surrounded by books, and they have all kinds of opportunities, and so they go into kindergarten and they're gone, and everybody else is behind. That's what Head Start was supposed to take care of. It also created some after school programs for latchkey kids. When I was in one of my doctoral classes, it's an interesting world when you get your doctorate from a historic Black university. It was a great experience. You hear about some things that if you stay over there in the private school, you never would know about. But it was one of the guys that we got to hear was the guy that headed the after school program in Nashville that was a part of this. Something so that kids were given some support they couldn't have gotten otherwise. Second thing he did, and the older I get and the more infirm I get, he did Medicare and Medicaid. God bless Medicare. I am sitting in, believe it or not, an $84,000 machine. That's what Medicare got billed for this thing. By Lexus for $84,000. Golly, Medicare and Blue Cross Blue Shield didn't pay $84,000 for it, but that was what they got billed. But Medicare for old people like me, and then Medicaid for those who were below the poverty level. It made major strides. I think the Affordable Care Act probably tried to pick up the pieces of Medicaid, but the reality is we'd never done stuff like that before. There was one of the things that FDR had done was Social Security. And Social Security was designed to provide for people who worked all their lives, were not able to make enough money to save any of it, and then they had to retire. They couldn't work anymore. And what you got to do is hope that your family's going to take care of you. Well, during the Great Depression, your family couldn't take care of you. And so that's the push for Social Security. And then Medicare just adds on to that part of Social Security. And it's wonderfully controversial. Ronald Reagan hated Medicare, thought it was a misuse of taxpayer money. But again, when he got old enough, I bet he took advantage of it. I don't know that, but I bet he did. Third thing that the Great Society did was it brought in immigration reform. Immigration, I know, is in the news now all the time. I'll let y'all argue that out. I'm not sure I understand. But our immigration policy dated back to the end of World War I. We had not changed. We had the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1924 had said that you go back to 1890, you figure out how many people from each nationality in 1890, according to the census, were in America. And then in any one year, 2% of that number, and only 2%, could immigrate into the United States. Well, obviously, there were lots and lots of Northern Europeans in America in 1890, and 2%, that took care of virtually everybody from England or Scotland that wanted to come. But all the people of Central and Southern Europe who suddenly now were trying to get out of religious pogroms, get away from all of the problems they had, all the Jews that wanted to get out of Germany during the Hitler years, couldn't come to the United States because the 2%, there was no room for them. And now suddenly there is a reform that allows more people who want and need to come to America for whatever reason had the opportunity to come. Now, what happens after that? I'm not an expert on immigration, so we'll leave that where it is. But at least there is an attempt to try to improve immigration so that more people that need to come are able to come. And then finally, 65, the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act may be the number one piece of legislation that Lyndon Johnson supported, because what it did was it tried to make certain that the federal government had the ability to intervene in voting efforts in any state, but particularly southern states, to make sure that black people were evenly cared for when it came to registration, and that they could vote with some degree of confidence. And all you got to do is look at all of these little towns pick on Mississippi, for why not, where the population was 98% black, but only 1 or 2 people were registered to vote. And if you go and look now, suddenly the leadership of those little towns is now black. It reflects the way people lived in those communities. And again, we talked about this, I think, last week, that when Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, one of his aides found him in tears. And the question was, you just signed one of the greatest laws in American history. Why are you crying? And he said, I have just delivered my section to the Republican Party. And we all see that the Solid South had been Democratic since the New Deal days. Now the Solid South is Republican. It's a major change. So if he had done those things and focused on them, Lyndon Johnson would be one of my political heroes. But unfortunately, he didn't. Unfortunately, he got suckered into Vietnam, and the problem. And some of you all fought in Vietnam or were in the service. I never was, so feel free to correct me at any time. I'm telling you what I observed as a college student at the University of Virginia, knowing that my educational deferment was fixing to go away, and it was not something I was really excited about, that it was going to go away. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were all part of what was called French Indochina at the outbreak of World War II. And all of them had been invaded by the Japanese. Japan had a growing population with almost no natural resources. And you've got oil, and you've got tin, and you've got all kinds of things in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos that they needed. And also in Malaysia, a lot there, Singapore. So the Japanese had invaded, and there was opposition on the part of the local people to the Japanese. In Vietnam, the opposition was led by Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh received some financial aid and military aid from the United States, operating under the presumption that the enemy of our enemy has got to be our friend. Kind of the same pattern we took with the Russians. Now, one of the arguments that Roosevelt had with, Roosevelt and Churchill are believed to have been, two peas in a pod. And they did get along wonderfully well, except that Roosevelt kept telling Churchill, when the war is over with, you will not be able to keep all of your colonies. They will want independence, and they will need to be given independence. And the same thing is true of the French colonies, because French Indochina, once the war was over with, the thought was they're going to want to be independent. Well, just as the British refused to give some of their colonies independence, the French sent an army in to reestablish control over Indochina. And so now, what had been fighting against the Japanese became fighting against the French. One of the things that we have, I always felt like we had, I was in my 20s, and I thought I knew everything, as all of us do when we're in our 20s. I had to hit the real world and realize I didn't know squat, but that was good for me. But the things that you saw were that I never believed that most European nations and America could tell the difference between communism and nationalism. That we just assumed that anybody that didn't do what we wanted done was under communist influence. And the theory, the so-called domino theory, was that if one of these little states falls to communism, then the next one, then the next one, and the next thing you know, communism is moving its way up through Burma, and Siam, and all the way to the gates of India. And so there is this concern that if the Vietnamese people aren't willing to go back and be part of French Indochina again, it must be because they are being driven by communism. And Ho Chi Minh, that we thought was a good guy, suddenly becomes a bad guy. Well, in 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, love the name, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese forces trapped the French army that had been sent down to put them back under control. And eventually the French realized that this ain't going to work, and they pulled their army out. So now it's the job of the great powers. You got to love the great powers, the European nations and America, to decide, well, we know what's best for you. So the 1954, after Dien Bien Phu, they came up with what were called the Geneva Accords. Now, this is the same thing that happened in Korea. We divided Korea on the 17th parallel, no, 34th parallel, and we said we're going to be one government in the north, one government in the south, and then we'll have free elections, and it'll be put back together. Well, they do the same thing in Vietnam. It's on the 17th parallel that there is a government in the north under Ho Chi Minh and a government in the south under Ngo Dinh Diem, who is a real loser, but he is the supposedly going to be the one that's going to keep everything in line until this vote occurs. But again, as in Korea, neither side was convinced they were going to win, and so the vote never happens. And so now there is an army in North Vietnam, there is an army in South Vietnam, but then there is what is called the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong are South Vietnamese people who want a unified Vietnam under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. And so now the Vietnam War suddenly materializes. Under Eisenhower, I think something like 500 or 600 American, quote, advisors are sent to try to help the South Vietnamese put together their army and give them some training. But again, it eventually 500 or 600 aren't going to make a difference. One of the things that Kennedy does, one of the few things he does with Johnson, because he didn't do squat with Johnson. He relied almost solely on Bobby. Bobby Kennedy was his number one advisor. And of course, Bobby Kennedy, it would be illegal today for Bobby Kennedy to be Attorney General under John Kennedy. You can't do that, but in that day and age you could. And so Bobby's within the government, but he's also unofficial advisor. And so one of the things that John Kennedy does is he sends Johnson on a fact-finding mission to Vietnam. Let's figure out where we are, what we can do, what needs to happen. And Johnson apparently falls in love with Diem, and these are the people we need to support. And American numbers in Vietnam rise up to almost 10,000 by the time that we're through sending, thought we were through sending advisors in. In 63, Diem is assassinated, probably by the CIA, although nobody knows that for sure. He's not very popular. We all saw pictures of the Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire, immolation, to protest the government. And he's replaced by Thieu, Thieu, who will be the president for the rest of the time. But Johnson comes away from Vietnam believing that we have to make a major effort in Vietnam to secure the government that we want there. Now, if you read Bobby Kennedy's book, Bobby Kennedy says that he was convinced that John Kennedy had decided the opposite, that if Kennedy had been reelected in 64, he was going to pull all the Americans out. And just turn it over to the Vietnamese. We don't know if that would have happened or not, because when Kennedy gets assassinated, we don't know. And now you've got Johnson, who is supportive of the South Vietnamese, that in ways that perhaps John Kennedy wouldn't have been. In August of 1964, there is an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, what's happening in the Gulf of Tonkin is that South Vietnamese soldiers are running hit and fall back missions against islands in the Gulf of Tonkin, and two American destroyers the Turner Joy and the Maddox are supposedly in international waters observing these actions, and they are fired on by the North Vietnam gunboats. There's lots of questions about this. There's questions about, number one, were they in international waters or were they in North Vietnamese water space? Number two, did the incident ever even happen? Who knows? Of course, August of '64, I'm 1 year away from graduating. I want us to get out of there. I don't want to go. And I'm willing to blame Johnson for everything. It doesn't matter. He made this up. It didn't happen. He did this just so that he could get what he wanted out of Congress. But he does get what he wants. He gets what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now remember, the Constitution of the United States makes the president commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but it leaves it up to Congress to A, declare war, to B, raise troops, and C, to provide for those troops. With the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically the president of the United States is given a blank sheet. Do whatever you got to do to take care of this. And until the Nixon years, when the War Powers Act will finally be passed, there's the president can do whatever the president chooses to do. And so what happens is that we now begin to bomb bases and strategic positions in North Vietnam. This is called Operation Rolling Thunder. And Operation Rolling Thunder it's almost 24/7. We've got these big bombers. They're going in. They're blasting all they can. We also increase our military numbers there. By 1968, we have a total of 500,000 men on the ground in Vietnam, and the word keeps coming back how well we are doing. Vietnam it's the first war that's fought out on our televisions as we're sitting down for our evening dinner. It's in the past in Korea you could do tape, but it all had to come back to New York and be processed in New York. So everything you're seeing was one day late. In Vietnam, you're seeing it as it's happening. And it probably gets more response from the American people than it would otherwise. But supposedly we're doing great. We've got these people on the run. And then in January of 1968, during the Oriental New Year Tet, there is what's called the Tet Offensive, where the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong together launch major assaults against every single American base, every single American position. They get all the way into the heart of downtown Saigon. And of course, to people at home, we thought we were winning. If we're winning, how can they do this? Now, the Tet Offensive almost destroyed the North Vietnamese. If we'd known how badly it hurt them to do this, we might have reacted better. But what the military immediately demanded was that they wanted 125,000 more men. And suddenly now there is this sense that maybe we need to find a different way to approach this. Supposedly, one of the things that happened that caused Johnson a lot of second thoughts was Walter Cronkite, who, Mr. Middle Class, Middle America, everybody here listened to Walter Cronkite. He went himself to Vietnam. He said, I want to see what's happening. And when he came back, he did a report that basically blew away some of the positive things that everybody had been hearing. from Vietnam. And Johnson supposedly said, if I've lost Conkright, I've lost America. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I was on my way back from spring break in Atlanta, driving back to Charlottesville, and so I missed the big speech when he announced he would not run for president in 1968. I got back to the dorm, and that was, hey, did you hear this? It was, you know, the thought was that he gave them, I think, a few more men, but not what they wanted. He began to question what he was being told by his military advisors, and I think he was really brokenhearted to know that this kind of shot his domestic program in the rear end, that he couldn't do both. It takes a lot of money to fight a war and to support a program like the one he had given. And of course, protests in all over the world in '68, but particularly it was all being driven by America in Vietnam. The University of Virginia has what they call Founders Day on April the 13th, and they have that's Jefferson's birthday. They have an academic procession, and they give out, I don't know, they chunk out some kind of awards, but they always have a speaker. And the speaker in 1968 on Founders Day, which has been my third year, was Grayson Kirk. Grayson Kirk was the president of Columbia University. And at the time Grayson Kirk was on our campus speaking to us, he could not get in his office in Columbia because it had been taken over by anti-war protesters. It was just kind of surreal. There wasn't a whole lot of protest at the University of Virginia. You know, Southern colleges tend to be a little more laid back than Berkeley and the Ivy Leagues, but there was growing concern. The finest history teacher I ever had was the guy that taught me American diplomatic history, Norman A. Graebner. Graebner did two things that nobody, I mean, I couldn't come close to doing, but nobody ever could do. His first lecture of the year, he outlined the 6 major principles of American diplomacy, and every lecture he gave from then on went back to at least one of those 6 principles. And the other thing he did that just blew my mind totally, and I bet will yours too, is he said, gentlemen, what we're going to talk about at the end of the year has not happened yet. And I said, oh my, you know, if you get within 40 years of now in most history classes, you've done a heck of a job. But he was right. He was that good. And of course everybody knew that here's all these fourth year guys at the University of Virginia, huge class in the chemistry buildings, only building that had an auditorium space big enough to handle it. But when we got to the end of the year, there were probably 250 of us taking the class. There were another 100 standing along the wall waiting to hear what he had to say about Vietnam, because all of us were going to get our degrees and all of us were going to lose our deferments. And it was important to hear. If Dr. Graebner thought we were wrong, maybe it made us feel better. I don't know. But in the election of 68, which we'll talk about 2 weeks from now, Mr. Nixon talks about his secret plan to end the war. He called it Vietnamization. What he was going to do was train the Vietnamese army to take over and pull the Americans out. Well, of course, that sounded good to me. Have at it. Right on, Mr. Nixon. It don't matter whether I voted for you or not. What I want you to do is to make it so I don't have to go to Vietnam. What he didn't tell the American people was that in order to do that, he was actually going to escalate the war in certain ways that he didn't bother to tell us about. Specifically, Laos and Cambodia, they'd had nothing to do with the war in Vietnam. The problem, of course, is that there were trails that run through those two countries, and there were sanctuaries where the Viet Cong were able to move from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, and they were able to run across the border and be safe from the American. Well, not under Mr. Nixon. We began to bomb the sanctuaries. We began to chase people into Cambodia and Laos. We, in essence, brought the war to them. They had not had the war. And he does all of this without telling the American people. Now we'll talk in 2 weeks about the Pentagon Papers, and eventually the American people hear about the Pentagon Papers. At that point, the anti-war sentiment explodes. You know, I always felt sorry for my buddies that fought in Vietnam, because they fought most of them because they were told to, but when they came back, they were treated like scum because you're over there, throwing your weight around, and it wasn't their fault. But there were an awful lot of people, one of them told me one time, I was talking about, my father's generation, and he said that those people called that the class of 45. Said people treat the class of 45 one way. They're all heroes, but none of us are. And I thought that was too bad. But in 1968, when the war is over with, one of the things when the war is over with, it turns out that in 1968, a group of American soldiers, guerrilla warfare, and again, some of y'all know a lot more about this than I do, but if it's us versus them, we're dressed one way, they're dressed another way, we know who we're shooting at. But in a guerrilla warfare, you don't necessarily know that. And what would happen is that American soldiers would be walking down a path, and there'd be what looked like a group of peasants going the other direction. And then about the time the peasants got past you, they would whip out Uzis and start blowing away the American troops. And so what happens is the American troops tended to fight back. And the classic example of that is the so-called My Lai massacre, where Americans supposedly, and I guess it was true, killed an awful lot of civilians in the little town of My Lai. And eventually the commander was, he spent a number of years in jail at Fort Bragg, but because of what happened at My Lai. But eventually we do begin peace talks in Paris, and the Paris peace talks go on about as long as do the ones that end Korea. And we'll pick up with the Nixon years. I think we have Nixon and Watergate. Sorry, Nixon, Watergate, and Ford will be our first time back after the Labor Day break. Any comments, questions, anything I missed? Because I'm talking.
To me, McNamara was a big figure in the Vietnam War, and he carried a lot of weight when he's his intelligence tended to overdo him, but
I was just going to ask, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's so much going on the Atlantic Ocean area. Was there not anything happening on the other side of the country between Russia or Japan and the United States?
No, it was the focus really at that time was on Cuba.
Your theory on Kennedy's assassination?
Yeah, I know.
I, y'all have to. I love my father-in-law.
We couldn't understand what you were saying.
He wanted to know my take on the Kennedy assassination.
Yes, you said you'd go back to that.
I really did. Marty's parents were fabulous to me and just great people. But Dr. Osborne was with the Public Health Service, and it was his job to appoint the people who did the autopsy on Kennedy, and he had to be present in the room. And to his death, he swore by the one bullet theory. I can't. I've never, other than a .22 rifle at summer camp, I've never shot a gun in my life. But I can't imagine a bullet doing what that bullet did, personally. I also know that when the gunshot went, awful lot of people headed for the grassy knoll. So I have no clue what happened. I don't think there's any question that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of it, but was he the only one who recruited him? You can make the case that he just was. He wanted to convince everybody what a great communist he was, and therefore the way to do that was to kill somebody important. But
But you mentioned something about the CIA.
well, there is a theory that Kennedy reined them in pretty hard. He fired the director and made sure that they didn't do anything without the approval of the Oval Office, and that there was those people have a reputation for having done some difficult things. The assassination of the Vietnamese president, for example. So I don't. Who knows? Yeah.
Great job again.
I know.
Thank you.
Fantastic.